Hi, everybody. It's Professor H here. We are going to go ahead and review our PowerPoint for Chapter 1. I'm going to try to keep the videos as short as possible. I have a tendency to go on for a bit, so I'm going to try to keep it reined in and just talk about what we need to talk about. All right, so we're going to get started. Our first question is, what is psychology? What the heck are we going to be talking about in this class? Well, psychology is basically the study of the human mind and behavior. And the word psychology comes from psych, which means soul, and ology, which is the study of. So psychology, we cover a lot of different things in psychology, and we'll kind of take a look at that on another slide. Uh-oh, it's not going. All right. Okay, so this is a depiction that you'll see in your book. This is Eros and Psyche, and I actually put a link on our Canvas page to their story. Eros is the son of Aphrodite. Psyche is this beautiful girl. Aphrodite was jealous of her, so she sent Eros, who is Cupid also, to make her fall in love with the ugliest person in the world, the most horrible person. However, when Eros got there, he's like, uh-oh, I really like this girl, so I can't do this. So that story is linked in your Canvas page, okay? And I'll go ahead and I'll put a link to that also in the bottom of this, in the description with this YouTube video, because I guess you can do that sort of thing. All right, the next question I have for you is psychology a science? This is sometimes people think, oh, it's not really a science. It is a science. What is your thought? Do you feel that psychology is actually a science? Yes or no? All right. So name some, I put other, because obviously I'm an experimental psychologist. I feel that psychology is a science. So name some other sciences. What other sciences can you think of off the top of your head? Okay, biology, chemistry, physics, all of these things seem to be sciences. Why are all of these things sciences? What makes these things sciences? Well, they all gather data and broaden their field and broaden the knowledge that they have in that field by using the scientific method. The scientific method is a set of assumptions, rules, and procedures that scientists use to conduct empirical research. So empirical research is research when we're observing things, we're seeing what's going on. And there's this set of guidelines helps us to know that the science that is being done in a proper manner. And once again, the scientific method helps us increase and modify our knowledge base. What do psychologists study? That's another question, a big question. So I put together a little list of things that psychologists study. They might study anxiety in children. How does caffeine affect thinking? How do birds recognize each other? A comparative psychologist might do that, because oftentimes we learn a lot about human behavior by looking at the way animals behave. And sometimes that animal behavior can get us, we can gain some insight as to how humans operate as well. How do people from different cultures react differently to negotiations? Because, you know, all the cultural influences in our life. What causes drug and alcohol addiction? What are the factors that lead people to engage in terrorism? What neurotransmitters are involved in depression? How do we create and store memories? How do I select the best employee for the job? These are all types of research that are done within the scope of psychology. So psychology has some controversial issues within it, where people are kind of more on one side of an issue than the other side of an issue. And these issues are the nature versus nurture issue. The nature versus nurture issue is all about what have we inherited and is kind of innate within us. What do we get from our DNA, and what type of things are environmental? So how much of who I am, how I behave, how I think how much of that is due to the genes that I've inherited? Or how much of how I think, behave, feel, all of that, how much is that due to the environmental factors, where I've been raised and the environment that I'm in? Another controversial issue in psychology is conscious versus unconscious processing. How much of our behavior is influenced by factors we are unaware of? Are we aware of why we do everything we do? I know I'm not. I know sometimes I do things, I'm like, why did I do that? There are things that lie beneath the surface that can motivate our behaviors. So, looking at the conscious processing versus the unconscious processing, like how much should we focus on consciousness? How much should we focus on unconscious processes? Observable behavior versus internal processes. Which should psychologists look at? And we'll kind of get a feel for this when we look at our historical perspectives in just a minute. Observable behavior would be things that I can see, it's pretty simple. I can observe them. I can see a particular behavior. I can see something happen, then I can see a behavior. And maybe I should just be looking at that part versus the internal processes. Like, why did that behavior occur? What was the thought process behind a decision being made? What is the thought process behind why somebody did an action? So that would be an internal process. Free will versus determinism. These are also all questions that you see, or this is a big one that you see in philosophy. How much do we control our own destiny? Do we have free will? Can we choose our path? Are we able to self-determine where we go and what we do? Or is it already predetermined for us? Are we able to really choose a path, or are we just going to go down a path that's kind of already laid out for us? So those are some controversial issues in psychology. Now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the roots of psychology. So psychology's early beginnings really took place in philosophy. So psychology is born from philosophy. Our early philosophers, our Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, questioned, do we have free will? How much is nature? How much is nurture? So those are, and they questioned other things, but these are two really big questions that our early philosophers used to look at and try to find answers to. Plato was on the nature side, where he felt that we are born with some innate knowledge already. So we are already pre-programmed to know certain things and to learn some things. He was also a dualist. A dualist would mean that he believes that our physical being and body is separate from our soul or our spiritual life. Aristotle, on the other hand, was on the nurture side. He believed that everybody came as an empty slate, that they were just a blank slate that their environment would play upon, and that is where you would gain your knowledge, is through learning and experiences. Aristotle also felt that you gain this knowledge through empiricism, which is by observing or experiencing the world through your senses. So that was his perspective and his viewpoint. We're not going to get real heavy duty into these guys. I'm just kind of giving you the basic background into these things. Aristotle also felt that he was not really a dualist, but it's a little complicated with him. But he felt that our soul or anything like that, the human spirit resided in the heart, and that your brain was just to cool your blood. So that's what he felt. He didn't feel like your blood, your brain had anything to do with knowledge. Your heart was the thing that is where you would gain your experience, knowledge, all of that would take place in your heart. During the Middle Ages, the teachings or the philosophy that was put out there by Plato and Aristotle and early philosophers was pretty much lost in kind of the Western world, because the church was taking over, and they felt like a lot of these types of thought processes were dangerous, and they deviated from what the church was teaching. So anything that was kind of deviating from what they were thinking at the time, people could be like burned at the stake for having that type of thing. They destroyed a lot of the manuscripts and books at that time. So in medieval times, a lot of that philosophy was lost in certain parts of the world. However, Abu Ibn Sina, Avicenna, I'm sorry, I don't know his name very well. Anyway, he kept Aristotle's ideas alive. He was a Islamic physician, and he contributed a great deal of knowledge to medicine, as well as keeping those ideals alive, the ideas about dualism and just all of the philosophies of Aristotle. So later on, other philosophies, other European philosophers could kind of look at what's going on in his work and revisit these philosophies that were put out there by our early Greek philosophers. So some of those European philosophers were René Descartes, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We're not really going to get into this because we're not a philosophy class. What you really need to know from this is that psychology has its roots in philosophy. And in the early times, there was not much of a divide between philosophy and psychology. Psychology kind of fell under the guise of philosophy. All right. Okay, so in the 1800s, this started to change. The first person that we considered to be a psychologist was Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German guy that, oh, this is hard to talk to the computer like this. I'm very sorry. It's so much easier to talk to people. For some reason, this just gets hard to talk to a little light on the screen. All right, so Wilhelm Wundt set up the first psychology laboratory. Basically, what he wanted to do was find out the basic elements of psychology, of your psychological experience. So he wanted to see the parts of the mind or the brain, how all of that works. Because at that time, there were some really big breakthroughs in like physiology and learning how things work. Wundt and his people in his lab felt that, well, we should be able to also figure out the different structures of the human psyche. So that's what they were doing. They were looking at the nature of consciousness, and they were trying to identify the basic structures of the psychological experience. They used something called introspection, which is he would ask somebody about an experience, and they would report on that experience to say what it is they experienced. So I could hand somebody like a pencil like this. And if I hand it to one person, they might tell me, well, this pencil, I like the pencil. I like how it feels in my hand. It's kind of cool. It has feels kind of bumpy when I roll it on my hand. And I really get a good feeling from pencils. And then I can hand the pencil to another person, and he might say, okay, I'm not a really big fan of pencils, but here's this pencil. It's really uncomfortable in my hand. I don't like the eraser. I think it's yellow. It's kind of cylindrical, has a black tip, and I don't really have strong feelings about it. Okay, so these two people are going to give me two totally different experiences with the pencil. So that's kind of an example of why introspection was kind of difficult to use, because you're using people's subjective experiences to try to identify what's happening in the human mind. One thing that Wundt did in his lab that was really good was that he created a reaction time instrument. And this instrument, and so he was the first one to kind of time what's going on up here in this cognitive space up here. So he would give you a cue, for example, a light would flash or you'd hear a sound. And then after hearing the sound or seeing the light, you would push a button. And he discovered that there was a delay between the time that you see the sensation, you perceive it, and push the button. So he determined that there was a difference between sensation and perception, and he was able to actually measure that time that it took for you to process that information and push the button. So that was a really good thing that they did in their lab. Edward Titchener was a student of Wundt. Now, Wilhelm Wundt was over there in Germany. And so his lab was over there in Germany. And then Titchener came to the United States and set up a lab at Cornell. And in Titchener's lab, he claimed that he found 4,000 separate sensations, including like vision, hearing, taste, things like that, that people could experience. So that was kind of interesting. Some criticisms of this technique of structuralism, which is like kind of our first school of psychology, our first perspective there. It's not a scientific technique. The reaction times were scientific, but the introspection where you are asking people about their experience and they're just reporting it, that was not a scientific technique in itself back then. People had difficulty describing some of their inner experiences. They had trouble saying how they completed tasks. However, the importance of the unconscious process was realized. So this is kind of the first time when the lights came on about the unconscious experience. Sigmund Freud was doing his thing at this time, and we'll talk at the same time, and I'll talk about him in just a minute. But the unconscious seems to us to be kind of second nature. We know that sometimes we do things that we're not aware of, or that our unconscious thinking can have an influence on our behavior. But people before Freud and the structuralism and such, they didn't really have a clue about that. They never really kind of thought about that. So these drawbacks led to a newer type of approach. So the next big approach on the scene was called functionalism. Functionalism was focused on the function of the behavior. Instead of taking the approach of let's just try to dissect out every part of this conscious behavior, functionalism leaned towards the teaching of Darwin, with the idea that we are doing behaviors for our survival. So that what is the purpose of the behavior? The purpose has to have some sort of connection to survival. So they concentrated on what the mind does and how the behavior is allowing a human to adapt to their behavior. All these psychological characteristics are developed to help us adapt. And then he was famous for saying, my thinking is first and last and always for the sake of my doing. So basically, this is the second school, which is functionalism. It's taking a little bit more of a holistic approach to the behaviors. The next big school of psychology on the scene was behaviorism. Behaviorism was a response to these other fields of, or these other fields of psychology who are trying to get into the mind and try to see what's going on up here between the ears. Behaviorists felt that really that's kind of an unknowable space because it varies so much from person to person. We could never really know what is going on. They consider the mind to be a black box. So just whatever's going on in here, we don't even know, we can't even look at that. So the behaviorists felt that they needed to have an objective analysis. So what they need is to look at observable behaviors. What can we see and document? What can we manipulate and change? So instead of focusing on the mind, they wanted to look at certain behaviors and how to bring certain behaviors under control. They wanted to study what was measurable, and they focused on stimulus response. In other words, let me see if I have that on this slide. Nope. So what you would see here is that you would have, here's a behavior. Somebody does a thing, or somebody, something happens and somebody does a thing. Now, the process would probably go, a thing happens, you have some sort of thought process, and then you do a behavior. So behaviorism is looking at, here's the stimulus, the thing that happened, and here is the result or the behavior that happened because of the thing. Whatever happened in the middle, we don't care about that. We're not going to look at that. So we'd have stimulus, black box, response. So they're looking at the antecedents of the behavior and the results, okay, the behavior itself. So they wanted to measure that sort of thing. And we're going to talk about a lot of his experiments a bit later. Another behavioral behaviorist, early behaviorist, was B.F. Skinner. What we're seeing here in this picture is called the Skinner box. We still use those in our labs today. It's a wonderful apparatus. His concentration was on how the consequences of the behavior affected the behavior. So in other words, if I do something and I have a good outcome, I'm likely to do that thing again. If I do something and have a bad outcome, I am not likely to do that thing again. And once again, we're looking at the stimulus and response type of thing, or in this case, we're looking at, here's the behavior. The behavior's here, thought processes that happen, don't care about those. And then here's the result. So I have a behavior, I have a good outcome, I do the behavior again. So whatever's going up here doesn't matter, okay? So interestingly, B.F. Skinner said at one point, he was considered to be a radical behaviorist, and he suggested that the concept of free will was simply an illusion. All human action, he instead believed, was the direct result of conditioning. So that's learning, basically, that all of our behavior is a result of some sort of learning. Like we're doing things, we're getting rewarded, or we're doing things, or we're getting punished so we don't do them again. If anytime we're punished for a behavior or have a negative outcome, we don't do that behavior anymore. When we're rewarded, we do the behaviors again. Anyway, so that's Skinner. Pavlov at the same time, he was in that kind of that behaviorist area, but he was actually you've probably heard of Pavlov's dogs, and we're going to talk about that a lot in our learning chapter. He was actually a person studying digestion. He was a physiologist that ended up having some major breakthroughs in psychology, but he would definitely be in the behavioral school. All right, so behaviorism perspective, reaction to introspection, I already talked about that. Not able to study the mind. Oh, here's that slide I was talking about. Okay, there's the stimuli, black box, response. We have John Watson, we have B.F. Skinner, and they suggest that observable, measurable behaviors are all we're going to look at. Okay, next, finally, we get to Freud. Okay, so when you look at the crash course video, he's going to talk a lot about Freud. So I'm not going to talk about him as much. I'm just going to kind of give a brief overview. So Sigmund Freud was I think he was a neurologist, and he ended up becoming a psychologist. So he started off with some talk therapies with his patient, and he kind of got the idea from someone else. And then he started talking to people, and he found out that talking to people makes them feel better. And then he developed a lot of theories that we use today and that are very important to psychology. However, he also had some really whacked out stuff. When you look at his theories of personality, when you look at all of his stuff is kind of based on your sexual experiences or your sex drive, basically. So he's got some whack stuff. And when I first took a course, one of my earlier psychology courses was a class in personality. And so all they really taught me in that class was kind of the wacky stuff that Freud said. He said some far out weird stuff. And then it wasn't until later, taking some other classes, that I learned an appreciation for him, and that I found out, oh my gosh, he's kind of the main guy that came along and said that unconscious feelings and memories can actually impact our behavior. And the other thing that he said that was really monumental and brand new, these are brand new ideas for the early 1900s. He said that our childhood experiences can impact how we are as an adult. Now, this is something that was absolutely revolutionary at the time. To us, we've been raised knowing these things, so it doesn't, it's not a big deal to us to think that way, but these were revolutionary ideas. He also, when we look at mental illness later and some of the defense mechanisms and stuff that he has come up with, that, you know, ways that we might be thinking in these situations is really interesting and really useful still today. So basically his approach is to talk to somebody and to kind of work through and get to the root of the problem. So he would care kind of what caused this, how did we get here, and from there kind of work through it. So he explored sexual experiences, desires, did talk therapy, dream analysis, and psychoanalysis. There's a famous couch. That's a picture of Freud's couch. It's a very famous picture. One of the comments I wanted to make real quick on a lot of this early research that we're talking about, most of this early research was done on white men, okay? And then most of Freud's patients were well-off white women, because he was studying hysteria and neurosis in women. And, you know, back in this time, you could actually have your wife committed to an asylum if you thought she was getting too far out of line, or if your kids acting up, you could have them committed. Anyway, so one of the ways that Freud felt you could access a person's unconscious mind is through dreams. And we will, when we talk about sleep, we'll go into those theories of dreaming, which are quite interesting. Okay. So the bottom line with Freud, psychoanalytic, his theory is called psychoanalytic theory. This led to psychodynamic theory today. Focuses on the role of a person's unconscious and early childhood experiences. All right, the next major historical perspective on psychology is Gestalt psychology. So Kohler, Kafka, and Wertheimer were German psychologists who immigrated to the US to escape Nazi Germany. Freud actually bailed out just in time there too. So Gestalt means whole. So it is based on the idea that the sensory experience can be broken down into individual parts. How those parts relate to each other as a whole is often what the individual responds to in perception. So in sense and perception, this is very important. We'll be looking at that chapter in like chapter 4, chapter 5, somewhere in there. So their basic idea is, you know, we might have some cells in the retina which are interesting to look at, but what we need are all of those structures in the eye. We have to have that physical structure, and then we have to also have the perception in order to have our vision working correctly. So Gestalt psychology is like looking at the whole rather than the pieces. The last perspective, the last historical perspective we're going to focus on is called humanistic perspective. This one is also still in use today. The important people here are Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow. This particular philosophy suggests that individuals will naturally try to grow and develop. We are all trying to be the best person that we can be, and that each person is trying to seek fulfillment in some way. There's an emphasis on free will, meaning that you have the ability to change your destiny, sail your own ship, that kind of thing. And it contrasts the ideas of determinism. Carl Rogers came up with an interesting theory called client-centered therapy. And this is a method that is really helpful for a lot of people. Client-centered therapy lets the client kind of guide where you go in the therapy session. He also believed, and these are the most important parts of, to me, these are the most important parts of his approach, is that he believed in giving unconditional positive regard, so that you would be able to go in there and say, you know, I smothered a cat, okay? And he would be able to take a breath, give you unconditional positive regard, and not say, what did you do that for? Okay, so sometimes there's some interviews with Carl Rogers that are really interesting, talking about how difficult it is to do this type of therapy, especially in like a prison setting or some other settings. The therapist, when using this technique, has to be genuine and they have to be empathetic, or it's just not going to work. But this is a particular type of humanistic approach that is used today as well. And Abraham Maslow came up with this thing called the hierarchy of needs. Now, the hierarchy of needs is based on, or is a explanation of what motivates our behavior. So according to Maslow, we would need to go up through this pyramid from the bottom to the top. We would have to have food, water, shelter, warmth. Next, if we accomplish all of that, we can have safety, employment, assets. Then from there, we can move up to having family, friendship, intimacy, belonging. Then we can have self-worth, accomplishment, confidence, and then inner fulfillment. So this is the very top of the pyramid that a lot of people do not reach, according to his theories. And we'll talk about this later in our emotion and motivation, or our motivation section. We'll talk about Maslow's theory. So basically, once again, this is kind of a humanistic perspective in that it assumes that all of us are just trying to go up this pyramid to reach this inner fulfillment. And that the other thing about this humanistic perspective is they're basically saying all people are good and all people have a kind of a good nature. And so that's another plus and minus of that. So our historical perspectives that we went over so far is structuralism, understanding the conscious experience through introspection. Functionalism, focused on how mental activities help an organism adapt to its environment. Psychoanalytic theory, which is Freud, the names of the people are here, focuses on the role of the unconscious and affecting conscious behavior. Gestalt, which is the whole rather than individual parts. Behaviorism focuses on observing and controlling behavior. And humanism, which emphasizes the potential for good that is innate in all humans. So those are the 5 historic perspectives. Now, out of these 5 perspectives, we still use a version of these lower ones here. We have a behavioral perspective, which is not behaviorism, but it is behavioral. We have a humanistic perspective that is still used. Gestalt, we still use a lot of those techniques when we're studying sense and perception. And then we don't use psychoanalytic theory, that's exactly Freud's thing, but we use a version of this called psychodynamic theory. So I wanted to real quick touch on the women within psychology. So basically, it seems today like there's more women psychologists than men. However, it has not been that way. In the early 1900s, there would definitely not be any females in this area. However, back in Titchener's lab in Cornell, this lady named Margaret Floy Washburn, she was the first female to actually get her PhD. So she was a student of Titchener, and she was at Columbia University, but had to switch to Cornell because she could not get her degree there. And she wrote books, and she was an amazing student and did a lot in animal behavior. And she wrote a really good text on animal behavior. But she, yeah, they wouldn't give women degrees very easily. Another woman is Mary Whiton Calkins. Now, she was a PhD of William James, kind of that same era back there. She went to Smith College, and then she went to Harvard. So what they would do is they would let these occasionally they could be convinced to let a woman sit in on the classes. Well, she did everything for her PhD, including her dissertation, the research, the defending the dissertation. She got everything done for her PhD, and Harvard would not give it to her. So she did not get her PhD. She refused to take it from another university that they wanted her to just say, well, just switch basically to the women's college and we'll give you the degree. And she's like, nah, I'm not going to do that. So anyway, she ended up teaching at Wellesley College, which is a wonderful women's college on the East Coast. She was the first female president of the American Psychological Association, the first female president of the American Philosophical Association. And really, women did not get a good foothold in psychology until the mid-60s. So another couple of influential women that were mentioned, I think these were mentioned in your book, I'm not sure. The first Latina to get a PhD in psychology didn't happen until 1962. And that was Martha Bernal. And then the first African-American woman to get her PhD was in 1933. And that was Inez Beverly Proser. So these are just some influential women. There are a lot of other influential women in psychology, but these are kind of the pioneers. All right. So our contemporary perspectives on psychology include a behavioral perspective, which is not quite as strict as this behaviorist perspective, but what the behavioral perspective looks at is we want to see what the behavior is and we want to change that behavior. So that's kind of the focus. We have a neuropsych or biopsych, which is what is going on chemically with your brain and your hormones and your physiology, what's happening there. And then the cognitive perspective. The cognitive perspective is all about what is going on in that black box, what is going on in your thought processes. And then we have the humanistic perspective, which is already, we talked about it basically. And then the psychodynamic perspective, which is very influenced by Freud's teaching. There's just a few things that are not followed, like some of the sexual stuff is not in there. Not that obviously sex drive does motivate behavior, so we're not saying that that never does, but it's just a little bit different than the Freudian theories. Okay, there's evolutionary psychology, which is basically saying, okay, everything I do and my choices, my mate selection, my behaviors for choosing that mate, all that stuff is based on evolutionary things. I mean, these are just different perspectives. Social and cultural perspective are the earlier fields of psychology did not at all consider the culture and social environment that we have. And now we know that that is so important with anything to do with psychology. All right, so which perspective is correct? So we've got all these different perspectives coming in. Which one's right? Well, there is no right and wrong. Basically, we take a little bit from each one of these perspectives. For example, if we were talking about depression, so we have somebody there that is suffering from depression. From a neuro or biopsych perspective, they might say, you know what, we're going to prescribe this medication for you because we think that we need to increase the serotonin in your brain, and that, you know, we can do these chemical things to assist you with your depression. From the behavioral perspective, it might be, let's identify some problems. First of all, let's measure some of your behaviors, like how many days are you unable to get out of bed? How many days are you able to shower? Are you able to prepare a meal? Because depression can be quite disabling. It's not just somebody feeling sad. It is way deeper than that. It's not just somebody being bummed out. It is, it can make you not able to go to work. It can make you not able to change your clothes. So you're going to identify some of the problem behaviors. You're going to measure them and see how often these things happen. And then the goal is to reduce that maladaptive behavior and increase adaptive behaviors. So you may want to say, okay, let's put in place this behavior. Every time you do this, let's do this behavior and see if we can increase the amount of days you feel like you can get out of bed. Let's see if we can increase the amount of times you can brush your teeth. So they can set up a behavioral paradigm where they can measure, put a behavioral solution in place, and then measure again to see how you're doing. The cognitive part, you know, a lot of times when you're depressed, you have very negative thoughts. You have maladaptive thinking, where you're thinking, I'm no good, I'm terrible, I'm not even worth talking to. You can have all kinds of things, or I'm never going to achieve this, or this is just too hard for me. There's no way I'm smart enough to do this. So you can have a lot of this type of thinking going on. So the focus is on your thinking and changing those thought patterns to replace harmful patterns with healthy ones. So that's what the cognitive part of this would be to work on your thought processes and give you tools for that. The humanistic perspective would still be like kind of that unconditional positive regard, which can be used in certain situations, maybe not in all situations, but in certain situations. So say this person comes from a family that they have never got support in the day in their life, and they have just been told they're a piece of poo and, you know, you're a waste of space and that sort of thing. And then they go out into the world, and then finally they seek some therapy, and they get somebody here who's like just totally supportive. That is a huge thing, to have that person be supportive. So that might be the humanistic perspective. And then the psychodynamic would be like, let's look at the past and look at the root of the problem. None of these other perspectives are going to be looking at the root of the problem. Neuropsych is a right now thing. Behavioral perspective is a right now thing. Let's just fix the problem we have now. Cognitive is let's deal with your thinking that you're having now. But the psychodynamic approach is where you're going to look at the root of the problem. So you're going to talk about it, maybe try to get to the, you know, some of those painful memories or painful experiences and try to work through some of those in order to move forward in a healthier way. So basically, which perspective is correct? All of them. I mean, we use portions of all of these different perspectives. Okay. So this is just a slide talking about sociocultural perspective, avoidance of ethnocentrism. So as I started to mention earlier, and I got off track, was that early psychology was basically all white males. And then after that, we got some white females in there. But pretty much it was all white males and all white females. So it's only actually in recent times that we have been able to look at people from different cultures, different races, and talk to them and say, you know, what is your experience here? And we have found that actually our culture we come from has a huge impact on how we think and how we process things. So it's really important that we understand the environment that that person is in when it comes to the social structure and cultural and ethnic perspectives. So those are newer things that we've added into psychology, thank goodness. Okay, here's just a list of contemporary psychology fields. There's biopsych people, there's evolutionaries, people that study sense and perception, cognitive, developmental, personality, social, health, industrial, organizational, sports and exercise psychology, clinical, forensic. Forensic has to do with like law stuff. Industrial organization is all about business. Big money there. Okay, anyway, so those are just some branches. All right, the cognitive revolution, this happened in the 50s. We started to get computer science and linguistics and neuroscience were emerging fields at that time. So that's what we're calling the cognitive revolution. This is when people really started getting interested in what is happening in the mind. And they started setting up models of how our mind works based on computer science. And those are some of the models that we use today to figure out how this process works, because we are kind of looking in that black box and we're trying to figure out how that black box works. Noam Chomsky was a very influential person. He's actually very politically active. I actually Googled him and I was like, oh goodness, okay. At 93 years old, he's like very politically active. I was unaware that he had a lot of activism in his lifetime until I was like doing some searches on him, preparing for this lecture. So anyway, he believed psychology needed to incorporate mental functioning to its focus in order to fully understand human behavior. So it's not just enough to look at this happened, so this person acted this way. We need to know the thought processes. So he felt that that was important. Okay. These are just, the next few slides are just different fields. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth over it because we're going to look at all these in these chapters that are coming up. I just included them because your book kind of had them in the PowerPoint. So sense and perception, studying all of our senses, developmental psychology. So we're looking at how we grow and develop, and how our moral reasoning, cognitive skills, and social skills change and develop while we grow. Once again, in the early 1900s, children were just considered to be small adults. And Piaget, Jean Piaget, who is in the picture here, he was revolutionary in finding out that and doing experiments to show that children are not little adults. They actually think very different than adults. Once again, it's a no-brainer to us these days, but back then it was a big deal. All right, personality psychology, where you're just studying personality. Social psychology, which is awesome and fascinating, and there's a whole class for this, which I recommend you take because it's a lot of fun. Health psychology, which is that combination of psychological, biological, and social environments. Clinical, where we're going to talk about our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors. And then there's some other fields, industrial, organizational, sports, forensic. Okay. And then our careers in psychology. I guess I'm just going to finish this up. It's only a couple more slides. This will be our whole chapter 1. Most of the careers in psychology require a PhD or a master's degree, but there is a lot of stuff you can do with a bachelor's. A bachelor's is actually handy for different fields. And I actually put a link to an APA thing on our Canvas site regarding that. So teaching, you can do with a bachelor's. If you're going to go into a lower, the lower grades, you just have to get your teaching credential on top of that. If you want to teach college, you need to have at least a master's degree. Research, at any level or any degree, you can be involved in research. Clinical psychologists need a minimum of a master's degree. Counseling psychologists, once again, master's degree. Social work is a tricky one because there is a social work master's degree that you can get, but within psychology, with a bachelor's in psychology, will get you in the door to work as a social worker. Corporate and marketing jobs, psychology is very important to understand how humans work in order to work in those fields. All right, this is employment in different areas. This just kind of has a little bit of a breakdown. Universities, 26%, hospital and health services, 25%, government, VA, medical, 16%, business and nonprofit, 10%, other educational institutions, 8%, medical schools, 6%, independent practice, 6%. So it's interesting that only 6% are going into independent practice. All right. Okay. So, and then this last slide is just another slide that shows different areas that you can work. All right, I think that is it for us. I'm going to stop the screen share, get giant on the screen here. Okay. All right, so that's it. Not the best presentation, but it's better than a poke in the eye, I hope. You guys have a really good day. Don't forget to send me an email if you have any questions, and I will be talking to you soon. Bye-bye.